Hello, everybody. It's a packed room here, and unfortunately, we are not doing this outside. So I apologize. Had we had the choice, we would have been like outside in a tent, but UK weather does not always cooperate. And so, well, what's next for the AI strategy? I have to my right Conor McGovern, who is the Vice President of Capgemini. And also to my left, I have to remember left and right, rough, is Adrian Joseph, and he is a Chief Data and AI Officer. Oh, come on, people, it's up there. You can see it on the screen. And this is going to be a nice conversation because not only are we going to be talking about what's next, is the fact that Adrian was actually on the advisory board for the AI Data, was it the AI Data Council?
The AI Council.
And so the National AI Strategy, this is one of your experts. So bombard him with questions because I know that Conor likes practical application. He wants to know what's going on. Like, what have you done? What is next? We all want to know that, but what has been done in the meantime? So we're going to start off with the basic question. You have 1 minute to introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Conor McGovern. I've spent my whole career to date in analytics and consulting. For the last couple of years, that's been leading the analytics and AI practice at Capgemini Invent. Invent is Capgemini's digital transformation and consulting business line. So I look after that group in the UK, and I also have a global responsibility. I look after a large team, which is effectively the data strategy and data science capability for Capgemini. But it's wonderful to see so many faces today. Less than a minute.
Thank you, Conor. You don't have to clap in between everything. Trust me, you probably at the end you won't want to clap them anyways. And Adrian, please.
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. I have many passions in life: fine wine, mountain biking, a couple of things, but there are 3 Ds that really underpin the work that I do at BT, the work that I do in the charitable space, and the work that I do with the AI Council and the government, for example. And I do represent BT today. I don't represent the AI Council, so just making clear that to everyone, please. And the first D is data and how we turn that into insight that really matters, and how do we do that at scale. Second D is about digital transformation. I spent a lot of my career, I was at Google for 10 years. I joined just after Google IPO'd, so I've helped to scale that business in analytics, in cloud, in advertising, of course, and in platforms. And the third D is diversity and inclusion. And diversity of thought is the thing that really matters to me a lot, but we quite often use proxies of demography to do that. So those are the 3 Ds that sit across the work that I do, and the passions that I have in government. My day job, of course, is to lead about 1,200 people to figure out how do we deliver value, business value and societal value across BT.
It was just over a minute.
Was it? Well,
Yeah.
I took 10 seconds from Conor.
All right, now let's get cracking on, because we all know we came out with our national AI strategy last year, and we want to know what's going on. And actually last night, I believe, I was actually there at London Tech Week, another event going on right now. We had the new digital strategy that was announced by Chris Philp, the Minister for Tech. And it was very interesting because we know there's always a lot of high-level talk, but with our AI strategy that was announced last year, it really got down to what key actions really wanted to be taken. And I would like to ask my fellow panelists here, we're nearly a year on, so really, what do we think is the message that got through to not only the general public, but people in business, academia, just overall? Do you think that message actually hit? Do you think people understand what this means? And if not, where do you think it's lacking? And if it has, where do you think it's hit? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to start. So from my perspective, I think the 2 areas of greatest impact for the national AI strategy have been with business and with academia. I'll talk about some other areas where I think there is still work to do shortly. But I think from a business perspective, both in the public and private sector, it's been warmly welcomed. I think it's been seen as something that's really crucial for the country as we grow and develop our AI capabilities. And I think there are aspects of it that do a fantastic job of actually showcasing just how strong the UK is in the AI space today, right? A solid 3 behind US and China, which is fantastic in terms of levels of investment and in terms of the innovations that we have in AI today. So, look, business warmly welcomed. I think there is still a lot to do from turning kind of strategy into action, and I'm sure that will be a theme that comes out from the conversation this morning. I think from an academic perspective as well, warmly welcomed. You look at things like the investment in the additional Turing fellowships and the focus on, growing the number of data scientists that we're able to create on an annual basis as well. I think the two areas where it perhaps hasn't landed, and again, this is my perspective, are with the public. I think there's still a lot of work to do. And I personally continue to be frustrated by media articles, for example, that are talking about artificial intelligence that always have the picture of the red-eyed Terminator, even at some completely innocuous part of artificial intelligence that's actually being covered in the report. So I don't think it's quite resonated as much with the public as it could. And then also the response from the unions has been quite muted as well, in terms of their perception that it lacks sufficient rigor around things like privacy and future employment. Okay.
We'll come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, my view is actually that we did a really great job of launching the National AI Strategy. A lot of people were involved, a lot of stakeholders were involved, a lot of the council members were actively involved in running stakeholder group sessions. I ran one, for example, on the adoption of AI. Wendy Hall did one on diversity and inclusion and skills and so on. So there was it was a really inclusive approach. I think they focus on 3 key things as part of that strategy to underpin the long-term investment in the AI ecosystem. That was a great principle. Second one was around ensuring that AI works for the economy and equally across regions and across various sectors. I think there's more work to be done there. I'll come back to that perhaps a bit later on. And the third one is around governance and making sure governance took a framing around driving innovation and investment, but at the same time as keeping us safe. So those 3 principles I think were really, really important and fundamental. There has been some progress in a number of areas. Conor's mentioned one. I think the work in conversions that we've seen, and actually the scholarships that went to those, over 50% were women, over 50% were from the black community, over 25% were disabled. So it was really good to see the blend of diversity and inclusion coming through from a skills perspective as well. What I also liked about the AI strategy was that we had 3-month objectives, 6 to 12-month objectives, and then longer term objectives. I still think there's a lot more work to be done to measure and to track against those objectives. Some of them we've done good work on. I've mentioned some around skills. We've seen more investment since 2019. The majority of the investment in AI since 2019, has come in that period. So we're seeing investment, but there's more work to be done. For example, the 22 billion that the government has committed to innovation, that's been delayed somewhat. So some good progress, some good start, some good framing, but more work to be done.
Definitely. You know what I want to come back to is the whole Terminator thing. I have to address this. It's actually one of the annoying factors that we have in tech. And one of the issues we also have is the fact that everybody uses tech for an ecosystem that is a lot larger. There's a very narrow perception of what tech is. And it encompasses a lot more than just AI and computers and coding. And the public perception, I think this is really what's lacking in any national strategy that has to do with any area of technology or AI, is the lack of understanding. So we have the leveling up agenda, and I'd really like to get your insights on how you think that our strategy of leveling up, really investing in the long-term education, I think I wrote down education, education, education as one of the areas that I think is really, really lacking. You know, how do you think that is going to play out? What can we do? What can we as people that work in this sector, what can people in this audience do? Because I know there are a lot of people in different areas.
So, I mean, we at BT, we just published or announced a bit of research that we've done with higher education students. So I love the question about and the focus on education, education, education. One of the big gaps that was clear in the National AI Strategy was around skills, and we see that. So something like 59% of students that are in higher ed who actually understood technology were unaware that they could do AI courses at university, 59%. Although about half of them said if they had better visibility of what was available to them, they might well have done, taken that route and gone into skills in AI to the degrees in AI and so on. Interestingly, what came out of that, and there's a big but to this, is that about 38% of them thought that, the perception of AI was dull. I don't know if anybody else feels that way. I certainly don't. I mean, I think we're in the sexiest part of the technology space, and that's going to continue to be the case for many years to come. But there's certainly a perception thing that we need to overcome in attracting and making it much more relevant and tying to the objectives, the passions that they have, the interests that they have, and this gap between the technical IT focus on skills, where we create more sort of lab coats, but increase the divide between what I call the technical side and the less technical side of AI. So ethicists and humanities and other skills. We need to have a much broader perspective around this. And the final point, if I may, on education is I think we need to do a much better job on educating our leadership in many of our organizations, whether in the private sector or the public sector. I think there's a real gap in terms of understanding of what true AI is and how we use it to drive business value and societal value.
Great. And I'll talk a bit more specifically actually about what my company does, and I think this is something that I'd love to see replicated even more broadly. So we have an initiative called Digital Skills for Positive Futures, which is based around three key elements. The first is to inspire school children in the power of digital and AI. And we do that by doing outreach to schools in social mobility cold spots, should we put it like that. And we've reached many thousands, tens of thousands of school children in recent years with that. Then we have various schemes and outreach to help with employment in data and analytics and AI. And that can either be helping people, supporting them into direct employment, or to further training that can then lead to employment for them. And then third is around how we support the sort of the innovation network in the UK. So we work with a whole array of AI startups and bring them into bigger transformational conversations with clients, which is both fantastic for the startup getting access, high up the chain within large UK or global organizations. But also, obviously, it's really eye-opening and innovative from a client perspective as well, seeing the very latest cutting-edge AI technology applied to their particular challenge.
Okay, so everybody's on board. Education.
I think it's bigger than education, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about 3 R's, right? So, how do we recruit? And that's a big one. How do we retain, more of the technical talent that we have in our businesses? And I think a big part of that is around vision and purpose and being clear about that. And the third one is around reskilling, and which takes us into the sort of education space and training and on-the-job training, but also, having squads that are combinations of technical capability plus business domain experts. That's and the other thing that we do at BT is expect our partners, whether they're the big consulting firms or smaller ones like the Datatonics of the world, to work alongside us to make sure that we're upskilling our teams, and they help us with things like academies and training and so on. So using our purchasing power and convening power, for example, to do things like this.
But the bigger question, I think, is how does that translate to your everyday person? Because they don't understand from an educational point of view. We have our leveling up agenda, as I said, but people don't even understand the concept of AI. The definition is something that your average person doesn't understand. People still have an issue with the security and the privacy aspects. How do we make that a priority for your average person? Because until that happens, you'll only have adoption for anything at a higher level. And we need people to understand from the very base. So it is a matter of teaching your students and having teachers that understand. So I think we have sort of a generational gap of where we are right now with education. And I'm wondering how we're going to fix that, because we can't have a strategy that's going to go anywhere if you have a generation that's completely stuck. And we're seeing that regionally. Like, what do you think regionally? How do you believe this is going to be manifested regionally? Because here, it's fine. London, it can be taken care of. The rest of the country. And we also, I just want to point out one thing, is that we have a lot of tech events in London, and that needs to be the rest of the country. And yeah, no, I don't sound like I'm from London, but I really am British American. I was born here. But it's something that I see needs to be translated to other regions of the country in order for it to be accepted, to become a norm, to become a normalcy. How are we going to achieve that?
This might be too micro an answer, because I'm just going to talk about what I've happened to do with my own team. Frankly, the market at the minute for good data analytics AI talent is obviously incredibly fierce. So we are allowing people to live and work anywhere in the UK effectively. So if you want to go to Glasgow or Manchester or Bristol or wherever, that's absolutely fine. And particularly with now much more flexible ways of working that we've all got used to over the last couple of years, we can do that. And I can only see that accelerating. I think that will have somewhat of an uplifting effect on the sort of the regional side of that, although I do realize that's more of a micro answer for what I personally am having to do with my team, rather than a broader answer for what we do with the rest of the country. But I think, some of the things that I've talked about there, like targeting those social mobility cold spots for specific actions around education, could certainly help.
Okay, Adrian.
So I completely agree with the comments that Conor made. I mean, things that we're doing at BT, for example, we have a relationship with about 30 different universities, most of them in the UK, and it's just not London, by the way. It's this golden triangle of London, Cambridge, Oxford, and how do we get out of that golden triangle, as it's called? And so, we have joint relationships with the University of Bristol, where we're doing some work at the moment around AI skills, and with CogX we'll be hosting the National AI Debate, as we're calling it, in October. We have, flexible working relationships, as Conor has mentioned as well. But I think working with universities and government and business, getting all three of those to work together is really, really important. On the education theme, I think it's not just about, society. I mean, it's about students, yes, and I've shared some of the data that we've seen there, but it's also about, teachers and also parents, right? Some communities that I engage with, we're told you can be a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant. Those are all great, fantastic professions, but, we're not being encouraged in some communities to think about the world of technology and AI and data, for example, because they're not seen by our parents as being, the types of roots that they have had in their past. So education at every level, I think, needs to be thought through.
Yeah. When people say tech and AI, they automatically, some parents think it's a startup. And that's happened to many people that I've spoken to. Their parents thought, oh, they're going to a startup. It's like, no, they're going to work at Microsoft. And
well, I did that a little bit when I joined Google. Right before I joined Google, I was very naive. This was 2006, just after they IPO'd, and I said, I love what you do, I think, but I don't know how I would, what role I would play, right? I had no idea. And then I reached out to my network and said, have you heard about this company called Google? Are they going to be here, for the next 10 years? And they were saying, are you kidding me? This is probably the best job in automotive to be doing, Adrian, right? Just get into it. But I didn't know, right? And I was been in the tech center. I have a degree in econometrics. You might think I'd been a little bit more knowledgeable. So, I think there's a real opportunity for us to get that message across about, the careers that you can have. And they're not all in tech. There's so many other areas that we can contribute.
Exactly. And I always think about, of course, it always comes down to the money. And you have government funding, you have industry and private corporations, but it's really a collaboration. So I'm wondering, I'm just trying to think of a good way to phrase it without being inflammatory. Let's see what I wrote in my notes. It's a little bit, I can be pretty evil. Where do you see some long-term investment opportunities and collaboration for government and business in order to move this agenda forward across the board? That's my nice way.
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, there's so many areas of, and we have an R&D center in Industrial Park. We work very closely with, government. A lot of the work that we do there is funded. We have, probably don't know this, but BT has more AI patents than any other organization in the UK. So, long term, I see, continuing to focus on the intersection between a number of technologies. So AI and cloud, for example, I see that as a core area. Climate and sustainability, healthcare, these are all really, really rich areas for us. Looking at managing big data sets, but then also thinking about how do you manage small data sets and extracting insight from those, I think is another really, really interesting area for future research and development. But I think one of the tricks in my view is to make sure that this is linked to value, and whether it's business value or societal value, being really clear about what are the high impact use cases. Really clear about the role that AI can play in unlocking value and doing that at speed and scale. So those are some of my comments on where we can invest and how we can think about where we invest in.
I think there's also an opportunity for the government to really take a lead on creating a much bigger collaborative data ecosystem with a lot of the data that we have across government departments today. It could be absolutely transformative from an AI innovation perspective. Of course, it's going to need to be governed carefully and secure and private where it needs to be private and very well managed. But very often one of the biggest barriers to success in any new AI endeavor is access to large volumes of high quality data. And having a more open collaborative data ecosystem at the intersection of both government and business and all of the amazing AI startups and scale-ups that we have in the UK could be really transformative for the country.
However, you say that about data. I always think we're in this area of analysis paralysis right now, where we have all of this data. People just don't know how to parse it out. And what we really need right now is not more data. What we actually need more now is the analysis of that data and actually to do something. Because I don't think we need to gather anything anymore. I think we already know the numbers. One of the things that was said yesterday at a talk I was attending was something like, we've had the largest growth in investment in the UK this last quarter. I can't remember the exact number. I want to say it was like 19 billion or something ridiculous. It's a very high number. But the fact of the matter is we know that number. We don't know who that money went to. We don't know where exactly, when you break it down, who got that funding. And that seems to be the biggest issue. We have all of these great numbers about what people are doing, but it isn't actually siloed down to where it's going. And so there is really this home of immense innovation, but how can we help maintain that level that the UK's at? How can we make sure that the money goes to the right place? For me, when we say what's next, it is really not about the technical aspects. It's more about the qualitative social aspects, because that's really what I think is next. We have, sustainability, we have data carbonization, we have data centers, talking about that tomorrow, we have accessibility. But when we talk about the money, it's how and where do we put it? And I think that's really probably one of the key important issues.
So, I mean, I can give you, examples of what we're doing at BT, right? And, there's no shortage of demand for the skills that exist in our team and in the room here today, right? No shortage of demand for the use cases. And so, it's a prioritization challenge that we have, right? So how do we figure out, which are the investments? Is it in propensity modeling in our global business? Is it in aspects action in our consumer business? Is it, the security work and anomaly detection anomalies that we use in workforce management and energy management? How do we make the decisions? And so we spend a lot of time working with the business units and our R&D centers to figure out, what are the list of use cases? Why do they matter? Where's the value going to come from? Is it going to come from a revenue increase? Is it going to make us more efficient? Is it going to help us manage risk more effectively? Is it going to increase customer satisfaction? Those are the value levers that we look at. Is it going to help with societal impact as well? Of course, that's another lever that we look at. And then making calls about, the size of the prize and then the ease and speed with which we might be able to do this. I would challenge the view a little bit about data. I still think that, it's a fundamental problem. If you're in a business that's as old as we've been around for 178 years. We're one of the few FTSE 100 companies that have lasted this long. But if we don't crack what we're doing now in terms of the investments that we're making in data and AI, then we're not going to be here for the next 10 years in the way in which we hope to be. And so that prioritization piece, but our data is in multiple legacy systems. It's hard to get a central view of it. I agree with the comments about if we could get, across government, data connections across various departments and be able to share that through a national data exchange. I think that's an area in which the government could focus. But a lot of my data scientists and AI people spend too much time doing data wrangling, too much time doing data quality and data hygiene work. And so, there's a massive piece around data that needs to be sorted before we can get on to the extract, the insight layer, which, I think we've got the capability to do, but we spend too much time doing the other stuff.
I think that's probably one of the biggest issues is cleaning, right? It's the cleaning of data. But of course, then we start with, where did you get it from in the first place? But that's a whole nother issue. I have a question about what do we think the biggest and boldest next steps for business to take can be? That's just curiosity.
The biggest and boldest next steps for business.
In relation to AI.
So, again, it touches on my previous point. I think some of the most exciting innovations that we're involved in with clients is where we are developing much broader data ecosystems for them. So it could be at the intersection of a telecommunications company and a retail business, for example. And there's huge potential and power to be unlocked there. Now, sure, of course, there are ethical and privacy and many other issues that need to be overcome. But we're seeing this right across the public and the private sector, is that desire to start to stitch together these disparate data silos to unlock new value from the new machine learning, the new artificial intelligence that you can layer on top. And look, we're a commercial enterprise, but it's not always purely just about business value. There's huge societal value. There's huge value from a sustainability perspective that can be unlocked when you start to join some of these silos together across organizations in public and private sector. So I know that sounds a little similar to what I said before, but I genuinely think there's huge value there and potential for the UK to really be a leader in that space.
But if you were going to go for a pie in the sky, what would be something really out there?
I think it would be that radical openness and transparency in data from the public sector. I genuinely think there is enormous value in that, both in terms of the AI startup ecosystem, but also in terms of the societal and the sustainability and the inclusion and diversity impacts that it could potentially have for the country.
Okay. And I think the biggest issue probably is getting the public on side. I mean, people don't even want a national ID. So,
no.
So there's that hurdle to jump over when you're trying to get transparency with anything in the public sector. But, Adrian, what do you think? Pie in the sky. Give me your pie in the sky first.
Pie in the sky, open source. One of the big challenges, right, is that, maybe 10% of organizations in the UK are now, either have algorithms live or are planning to. But guess what? The big organizations like the BTs are 4 times more likely to do that than the SMEs. And so, thinking about how we open source some of our algorithms, right? So I would, for example, love to spend a bit more time than I've had so far looking at some of the, the AI patents that we've developed and thinking about ways in which we might open source some of those and allow, SMEs and other communities to start working with them. I think that would be an interesting one. Other things, I think, in the world of data governance, and data governance is a huge area, the ethics of AI. I haven't talked about that a lot so far today, but that's one of the biggest hurdles to overcome. And so, I love what Rolls-Royce have done, right, in releasing their framework for, the governance of AI, where they've got 32 different characteristics that they're tracking. Some of those are processing, some of it's enabled by technology. So, again, organizations, releasing what they're doing in areas that are for the national good and perhaps not in competitive spaces. The data sharing, I think, is a big one. Data exchanges, at scale, not just for government data, but actually for commercial data sets as well. That's a massive idea. And we just all need to get behind the skills in a way in which we haven't, done enough of as yet. And for it to be much more diverse. I mean, it's not okay that just 1 in 10 data scientists in the UK are female. That's just not okay, right? It's not a good thing. And so, spending a lot more time thinking about how do we get the diversity that we have, I think, reflected in this room that I see, or in our customer bases, actually reflected in the teams that we hire and train and support. So those would be some of the things that I would think about.
Yeah, I really like your point about that open ecosystem. Gartner, way back in 2015, said, businesses, you are your algorithms. And that is true for many, many businesses in the knowledge economy. But I am absolutely supportive of businesses doing more of that. I think it's going to be beneficial for all.
So probably the key point is collaboration, education. I'd say two of the main things, education and collaboration, and transparency. We're not going to go into the third. We could, but I'm pretty sure that there are people in the audience that have great questions. And I know from what I've heard about the audience, there are some great questions out there, some great points to be made. I will finish with one little thing before we open up for questions, is that for me, safety online and surveillance is a very big key issue. I worked in intelligence, so I'm kind of dirty. But safety tech is one of the areas that I think with everything that we do within the AI sector needs to be built into the DNA of a product, just like accessibility and transparency. I think these are things that really need to be the base core fundamentals of your company should have. So I just want to say that. That's my little input of the discussion. And questions. I mean, I do want to say thank you to the panelists, but, before we get there, questions. Well, it was that guy at the back. Oh, he was, okay, that's fine. Mic person, wherever you feel. But there's someone down here also.
Great, thank you for the talk. My question is perhaps more towards Adrian, but the European Union is trying to provide a common regulatory framework in terms of privacy, in terms of providing common values, in order to make a common market that helps scalability and investment inside the AI and tech fields. How is the UK, given we're now post-Brexit, looking at these regulations? Are we going to collaborate with them? Are we going to make our own decisions? How do we see our strategy going forward in that sense?
So my personal view is that there's a lot for us to learn from the EU, the US, and Singapore and other jurisdictions around privacy, ethics, trust, and all of those fundamental things. So I don't think we should lose that. My belief is that at a national level, we're not just thinking about what we do in the UK, but we're working very closely with our international colleagues, to figure out how do we solve for some of these things once and do it well. So I don't think that's gonna change. That just because we're out of the EU, we are part of a global system, right? And so I don't think that, from what I'm seeing and hearing, I don't think that's fundamentally going to change. I think it's also an opportunity for us to do some things a bit differently as well, by the way. So, the EU guidelines are a little bit restrictive in some areas and, too broad. And I think we can be more specific with some of the, the EU guidelines that we're going to publish on AI in the not too distant future. So keep doing the collaboration, keep learning, keep sharing at an international level, not just a national level. But also, let's figure out a couple of things that we could do that will help us, to move a bit faster than perhaps we otherwise would be.
And that was actually one of the points that Chris Felt made yesterday at his talk, high-level detailing the new, I can't remember what it's called now.
The digital strategy, national digital strategy.
The national digital strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah. The names. But yeah, he actually, so you might want to take a look at that one. It is published, because he did talk about external and international uses. Question? There was a guy at the back and then there was a guy down here. Microphone person. You're going to have to do some running because that guy's arm is going to get hurt.
Conor, you mentioned unions and a lack of engagement. Could you expand on that and how possibly we could overcome that?
I'm not sure it was lack of engagement. I think there was a feeling from the unions, particularly the prospect union, that the strategy didn't have enough around privacy and employment and kind of protection for workers. No, it's a 10-year strategy. I'm sure that can come. But I saw that as a bit of a bridge between the original question was around what's the impact on business, on academia, and on the public. And I see that kind of that union one as a bridge to having more of a positive impact from a general public perspective.
Finally.
Thank you for the discussion. So my takeaway from what you just talked about is that we're deep into figuring out what the implementation of the strategy is going to look like. Thinking beyond that, how are you going to approach assessing the outcomes of the implementation of the strategy in the future in the context of the entire country, the people, the industry, and so on? And what would you consider key results of a successfully implemented AI strategy in the future?
So there will be a whole host of dimensions to that, but let me just touch on a couple. If you look today, depending on whose numbers you believe, there are upwards of 250,000 unfilled data analytics and AI jobs in the UK today. So certainly closing that gap over the longer term certainly has to be one KPI that we'd need to be looking at. We have a really strong position in the UK today in terms of the amount of public and private investment in the AI ecosystem, particularly in our startups. And again, that's something you'd be looking to have as a key performance indicator as the strategy gets implemented and turned into action. How is that trending? In terms of the scale and sophistication of our AI innovation ecosystem as well. Adrian?
So, I mean, I think some of those are fairly well detailed in the national AI strategy, right? For the short term, the medium term, and the longer term. My worry is a question around: are we doing enough to track that we're on track? It was a pretty ambitious agenda, and so I worry about that a bit. But I would look at the three key strands. One was about the long term investment in the ecosystem in AI, and so looking at how do we measure that? The engagement, how many startups have been successful, funded, encouraged, what support, and having some metrics around that. Might have some metrics around regional and sector adoption rates, and we're seeing very, very different rates of adoption on sector and geography. And then the third one is around the governance and making sure that governance is actually driving innovation and investment as well as protecting from all of the harms that sit there. So I'd be measuring, very clearly adoption rates, investment rates, and we're tracking some of that at the moment. As I said, we've seen more investment in the last 2 years. The majority of the investment in AI has happened in the last 2 years in the UK. So, but I think it's more about tracking at the moment than about having the metrics. That's my worry.
And I'd say that's probably one of the biggest ones, especially when it comes down to governance. Because it's not like that system is exactly technically friendly.
No, but I think it should be tech-enabled. It's not just about policies and procedures, but actually I think we can embed, explainable AI into our tech, for example, and to do that, at scale, and to spend a lot more time doing that. So I think it is a blend of those things. I know there was a lady with a hand up over there.
Yeah.
I have a question. Sorry. Yeah, right here. Okay. With regard to AI, I believe we all have been very tuned on the use cases and everything, and we try to turn our society sort of in a user journey sort of methodology, like every human being is just a box. And we all tend to follow up the rule 80-20. If something works on the 80%, 20% is, they'll figure it out. I think the key role of AI, the way I see it, is about adding the human element to our systems. And it's because we are so much into the system and we are moving so fast, like I think we have missed out our own selves within that. There is no human element. There are plenty of use cases which simply does not address that 20%, and there are a lot of things. And when we talk about the government and the regulation, I think, yes, we look at the bigger services like Google and the Uber and everything as the perfect services. But in reality, I think governments need to add some sort of check and balances which add the humans. It has to be human inclusive. It's not just, everything is not a user journey per se. So it has to have some sort of exceptional level for the human beings, for the making errors, to handle that and handle that in a smarter way. This is how I think AI is. So that's my idea. And if you can, please comment on that. Thank you.
But that's one of the reasons why I did mention safety tech and the social aspects of it being in the DNA. With safety, I'm talking about human safety. That is, we are safe in our physical presence, but we're also safe in our digital presence. And so for me, that is the human aspect of you as a person, the average person. Accessibility, that's for people with vision issues. I have a vision issue. People that have hearing, that are hearing impaired, people that have any sort of, I hate the term, disability, but that's what I meant when I said it needs to be embedded in the DNA of any product. Anything that's being built needs to be looked at from that perspective. But that's my opinion.
Our light is flashing at us, so I'll be as quick as I can. I've learned the hard way in my career that the single biggest point of failure in any analytics or AI endeavor is a failure to actually drive to action at the end. So you need to start with what that human interaction with the AI is going to be, how that person's role is going to evolve and change, what that new customer experience is going to feel like, and then work backwards from there. So we always start with that kind of end human interaction in mind and generally work backwards from there.
I would say that, look, the algorithm is actually outperforming us in many areas, right? Whether it's in language skills, transcription, in healthcare and so on. But, the human in the loop, a lot of the research that I see and evidence suggests that actually it's the combination of the algo and the person that gives us the best outcome. So I would agree with the fundamental statement that I think you made in your question.
Okay, the red light is blinking at
We don't have
us.
time for this lady to ask a question.
Oh,
No.
go ahead. Okay.
Can we recap the question?
Yeah. We've talked about bias within. Oh, sorry.
This,
It is working now.
Yes.
we've talked about the gaps we still have in
Gaps.
diversity. So from 10% of women being data scientists to the regional variations around that, etc., and stuff like that. We're at the moment setting the AI strategy, and businesses are doing that, etc. How do they mitigate the risk of bias being introduced into that AI strategy when we still have a massive challenge around diversity?
I don't think that we can entirely, right, and that's why we spend a lot of our time in the hiring that we're doing to get the right balance of gender, of ethnicity, in the end we want it to be around diversity of thought, because we think that's the thing that matters the most, but reflecting the societies in which we exist. But I don't think we're going to be able to do that. I mean, in my own team, I hired a very senior lady to lead AI for us. And guess what? 50% of her team now are female, right? And so one thing I would advise you to do is to whatever the type of diversity you're trying to achieve is to hire a very, very senior person of that type of background, because they will very, very quickly begin to attract, those types of profiles. But in the interim, there's a lot that we can do, through technology, I think, and identifying biases. For example, we can look at sensitive data, right, and remove that from the algorithms, but then bring it back in to check that we haven't had any unintended consequences of a gender bias or an ethnic diversity bias or any other sort of biases. So one thing is that's how we operate in terms of safe AI, is to take that sensitive data out, but bring it back in to just make sure that the outcomes of the algorithms aren't delivering any of those biases that we would hope not to achieve.
Okay.
And just a quick shout out to Claire Williams, who asked the question, voted one of the top 20 women in data last year. So.
Thank you for the question, Claire, and everybody. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank my panelists, Conor McGovern, Adrian Joseph. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suki.
And
Thank you,
have
Suki.
a wonderful day, everybody, and thank you. Please give them a round of applause.
Thank you.